about the idea of sophisticated compliance. So, you know, generally we find with our customer base that mission or safety critical projects, they need to meet all the coding rules. But having said that, there are many reasons why very many projects can only achieve partial compliance. We have the issue of legacy code that existed prior to the establishment of coding rules. We have other issues like hardware constraints or compiler constraints, or indeed libraries that you adopt, which all may place constraints on your ability to fully follow a set of coding rules. And I suppose the final point is that you could have a time to market issue, or you could have a pricing issue that requires you to accept reduced compliance rather than trying to be fully compliant right from the start. So let me just show you some real-world examples, again dropping back into QA Verify, for how a more sophisticated level of compliance can be created. So I'll stay in my project CGI. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to my other branch here, so I move away from this baselining example that I have. So we'll go down to version 3.2.6. And let's just look at my MISRA coding rules in this case. So what I want to show is the types of, the way in which you can actually achieve compliance, accepting these various reasons for not fully complying. So I've got one particular issue here that I'm going to decide. It's rules 272, and it's about sorry, I think I'm on the wrong one. I'm going to talk about rule 392. And this rule has, okay, so I'm actually going to have to do a small bit of work here, if you don't mind. I'm going to remove some suppressions because I need to add them, re-add them. Okay. So sorry about that quick jump away from where I needed to be. Okay, so working on version 3.2.6, I'm going to focus on rule 272, and I'm going to start by saying, okay, I want to just remove this one single diagnostic. So this particular diagnostic is about a comment in code, having code inside comments, I should say. And what we want to do here is suppress this diagnostic. And what I'm trying to do is say, I'm not going to try and fix this right now. So I'm going to associate it with a deviation tag. I've actually got a deviation already created. So this particular deviation corresponds to this rule. I'm quite happy with that, and I'm going to add that to my suppression list and then just go ahead and implement it. And we'll notice right away that that message has gone. It's dropped to 0. So that's an example of just removing a single diagnostic. I can also, if I just move to a different example here, I've got a rule which has 54 occurrences of a message which says I'm using a fundamental type. Essentially I'm using unsigned int or unsigned long or one of the fundamental types. And rather than fixing that, I want to choose to suppress all the occurrences of that. So I'm going to go into a suppression options screen for this. I'm going to suppress every message in the project, of which there are 54, and I'm going to carry this forward as an instance. And what that really means is that I'm allowing myself to live with these 54 occurrences, but no more. And I'm going to use a different deviation tag for that, which I've pre-prepared, and I'll add that to my suppression list and actually go ahead and implement it. So what I've done now, as you can see, is I've reduced those 54 items down to 0. And I'll do one more suppression just to give a broad idea of the kind of things you should expect to be able to do. I'm going to go to this file config.h, and I'm again going to say basically this is a file which I wish to suppress everything in this file. There are 2 different messages that occur in the file. I'm going to use a different deviation that I've already created prior called config header, and I'm going to carry that forward as a rule. In other words, I'm no longer interested in these two messages occurring in config.h. So I'll add that to my suppression list and go ahead and suppress it. So just to try and summarize what I've done, I've actually reduced a number of messages in this particular version of the project, but I've told it to carry it forward so that in future versions I also, subject to certain constraints, I expect to see those messages being suppressed. So what we can do now is go into a suppression management screen to actually see these three instances. So looking at the first one, let me move that to the middle, I can see the impact of the suppression I've just made on this Miseru 272. It actually only occurred in 326, and it didn't occur in the later version of this particular file. If I then move on to the second example, I have 54 occurrences which are all being suppressed, and they carry forward, and I can actually see the detail of them. I can actually make this bigger. I can actually jump into any of those locations to see the particular situation where that occurrence happens. So here, for example, here is a suppressed message at this stage telling me that I was using a fundamental type within a function definition, but it's suppressed at this point. And then of course I could do the same thing with the config.h. I can see the impact of the changes I made there, and you can see there were a different number of occurrences in each version of this config.h file, and that just corresponds to the number that occurred. So going back to my web message browser, what I can observe about, in particular, which is interesting about the middle one, is that although I have 0 at this point, as I step forward, there is actually a new occurrence in version 328 of that particular diagnostic. So you can see that a new direct use of a fundamental type occurred a little bit later in my sequence of snapshots, and I didn't give permission for that to be suppressed. So at that point in time, the developer would expect to actually start using a proper type def at that point and not use the fundamental type. So this is an example of how I limited the scope of my suppression. And just lastly, if I can go into my ability to report on all of these suppressions, let me go into my a report that I've called Adjusted Compliance, which works for this project. I suppose I can do it on this version 328. I have a compliance summary which tells me what my overall compliance figure is for this project. But most importantly, I can then go into all the suppressions that I put in place. So I can see the different deviations I created with their description. I can see the number of messages that were suppressed by it. In this case 0, because this particular one didn't carry forward. This second one, I suppressed 54 items, and they have made it into this version 328. And in this last case, where my deviation called config header was a special deviation for config h because it came in from another project, I can see 24 diagnostics being suppressed. And I can see a different format of the same information showing me all the suppressions by file. So this information means that I haven't lost track of any of the things that I've chosen to suppress. They still exist in the quality management system, and I can report on them. But quite importantly, I have reduced the number of non-compliances that I have to deal with. And in some of these cases, these numbers were reduced. So just to summarize that whole discussion about suppressions and deviations, I introduced the idea of a deviation. It's basically a authorization for a diagnostic suppression. It's a one-to-many relationship. One deviation supports many suppressions. You can suppress different types of entities. You can suppress a single diagnostic. You can suppress an entire coding rule or group of messages, or you can suppress an entire file. And you may have noticed I could actually do a variety of other things as well. I could partition those types of suppressions as I wish. I have options with each suppression as well. I can carry them forward as an instance, which means I basically follow my baselining rules. That means that only where the code lines are unchanged does it carry forward. Or I can carry forward it as a rule, which simply means whatever the rule that I set up was, I reapply that rule in the future snapshots. And very importantly at the end is that we can produce evidence of compliance through reporting and through that suppression management screen that allows us to see exactly how we're getting on with compliance, and to be able to produce maybe to our customer our true level of compliance and what things we've chosen to suppress.